Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Meredith Broussard is a data journalist and associate professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of New York University, as well as research director at the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Her book, More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender and Ability Bias in Tech, explores the way technology reinforces inequality and asks the question, what if racism, sexism and ableism aren't just bugs in mostly functional machinery? What if they're coded into the system itself? It's a great read, full of eye-opening examples and insights from a writer with the technical and ethical expertise to get to the heart of what's clearly a very significant challenge for society. We were only able to scratch the surface in this short conversation, but it's changed my thinking about technology ethics, and I was very grateful to Professor Broussard for taking the time to talk to us. So, Meredith, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So we're here to talk about your book, More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender and Ability Bias in Tech. So there's loads of really interesting stuff in that book. But I just thought we could start maybe with the title. So why is it called More Than a Glitch? Why is there a problem that amounts to more than a glitch in your view?
Well, we tend to talk about glitches as momentary blips, things that don't matter. But one of the things I'm arguing in the book is that when racism, sexism, or ableism manifest inside technological systems, we should not treat it as a blip, as something inconsequential. We should treat it as a bug, right? A bug is more consequential than a glitch in computer science parlance. And also, when these kinds of problems emerge, we need to look at it as an opportunity to re-engineer society as well as re-engineer technological systems.
Right. Okay. So some people might be thinking, yes, clearly there are problems with like bias and discrimination in technology. And what we need to do is just kind of reprogram the system so that they don't, encounter those problems. But you're saying it's a broader issue than that. I think at one point you say discrimination is coded into the system.
Exactly. So if we take something like facial recognition, well, most people know by now that facial recognition systems are biased against people with darker skin. And a lot of people imagine that, oh, well, maybe this is because there aren't a lot of people with darker skin or with a range of skin tones in the training data set for the facial recognition system. Maybe we just train the system better and then we'll get more accuracy. But actually, if you look at the history of color film and the history of digital vision technology, computer vision technology, which is built on all the earlier technologies like color film, this issue of racism goes very, very far back. It goes back as far as Kodak developing color film. And until the 1970s, brown tones, including skin tones, looked really muddy on color film because Kodak would send out these cards to the individual photo labs for them to tune their equipment on. And the cards had a picture of a white woman with some primary colors. And so Kodak just did not think that representing a range of skin tones was important. And then they did make that change, as I said, in the 1970s. But the impetus for that was not awareness of civil rights, more actors of different skin tones gaining prominence in Hollywood. No, it was furniture manufacturers complaining that their walnut and mahogany furniture looked muddy in their catalogs, and they were not going to switch over from black and white catalog printing to color printing unless Kodak made the colors look better. All right. Yeah. So this is the background to something like facial recognition, not recognizing people or misrecognizing people with darker skin. And it's a much bigger problem than the training data.
Yeah, sure. Um, so yeah, that's a really good example of how technology can entrench discrimination and bias, and that, there are loads of other examples in the book. One of them that listeners might be familiar with is the racist soap dispenser. So there's this case where the people were training a soap dispenser using only images of white people's hands, and then as a result, it only dispensed soap for white people. But yeah, so there's loads of other examples in the book, as I say, in policing, business, education, medicine, all sorts of different areas. So why do you think this keeps happening?
I think that there are many factors. One major contributing factor is unconscious bias. We all have unconscious bias. We're all trying every day to become better people, but we're not there yet. And what happens is we not only go around in the world acting according to our unconscious bias, but we embed our unconscious bias in technological systems. Right. So when you have a small and homogeneous group of people making a technological system, which is generally what you do have in Silicon Valley, then the collective unconscious bias of the creators gets embedded in the system. And once bias is embedded in a technological system, it becomes very hard to see and even more difficult to eradicate.
Sure. And one of the themes that runs through the book, it seems to me, is it seems like you think we tend to overestimate how useful technology is in a general way, right? So we tend to kind of think we're going to be able to rely on technology to do all sorts of things. And actually, in a lot of cases, the answer is just to stop using the technology and go back to a more low-tech solution. Is that right? Why do you think we have this kind of tendency to overestimate how well technology works?
Well, there's a kind of pro-technology bias that many people are operating with, and it's a bias I call techno-chauvinism. It's the idea that technological solutions are superior to others. And what I argue instead is that we should think about using the right tool for the task, because sometimes the right tool for the task is absolutely a computer. Like my smartphone, you are going to pry it into my cold, dead hands. Like it is really useful for traveling. Like it is useful for a whole range of things. But then sometimes the best tool for the task is something simple like a book in the hands of a child sitting on a parent's lap. Right? So technology is not going to save us from the problems of humanity. It's not going to help us ascend to some kind of higher plane of being. It's just a tool. And what computers do is they literally compute. They're just machines that do math. I mean, it's insanely cool what they can do, but they can't do everything. They're just, hunks of poisonous rocks. Like they're not people. So we just need to not overestimate their capabilities.
Sure. Yeah. That sounds right. So just to be clear, what you're not worried about are these kind of science fiction scenarios of the computers taking over and, well, to what extent do you think we should be worried about computers sort of taking over people's jobs and replacing professional jobs and things like that?
So I think that this is, it's a problem when people imagine that automation is going to replace human jobs and they overestimate the capabilities of the automation. Right. So automation is fantastic for a lot of things, but there are a number of things that are still useful for humans to do. And also humans need jobs. We have a lot of people out there and people like having jobs. And I like my job, for example. I don't want my job automated away by a computer. A computer does not do as good a job as I do at my particular job. So, it doesn't make any sense to try and replace people with computers in all kinds of situations. So I think that the right tool for the task is a good way of thinking about it. I mean, another problem with this, though, is that people imagine that they're going to be able to replace workers with computers, and they don't have really good foresight. about it. So they imagine that you're going to be able to take a computer program and write it once and run it anywhere, or they don't expect that the computer is going to wear out or break down. And guess what? It's going to wear out and break down. And then you're going to need people to repair it. And then the system is going to get all messed up. And, it's actually like a pretty high precision operation to automate things. And, people are pretty bad at it, honestly.
One of the things that you identify that computers are kind of not good at doing is, well, I think you say humans are often good at dealing with edge cases, but computers are not. So what do you mean by that, and why is that a problem?
So in computer science, we talk about edge cases as cases that fall outside the norm. So when you write a computer program, you think about, okay, what is the vast majority of a response going to be? The vast majority of people, when they use this computer program, what are they going to need out of it? And so that's what you design toward. You design toward the majority. But life is all kinds of edge cases, and computer scientists just don't deal with edge cases. It's like, okay, this is outside of the realm of what the computer can deal with. And so I'm just not going to program against it, because computer scientists know you can't write a computer program for every single situation.
Right.
You've probably heard of black swan events.
Sure.
Those are like, the black swan event is the name for a rare occurrence that, nevertheless occurs. So you design for the majority, but people don't fit into the majority. If you're not neurotypical, if you have some kind of disability, and you also have to think about who is the base case that computer scientists are programming for. And in general, it's the people who look like the computer scientist who's in charge, right? And as we've already discussed, Silicon Valley has a diversity problem. Many individual companies are working on it. Many individual teams are dealing with it, but overall, the industry is still not doing very well. So edge cases are just not programmed for, but they matter.
Yeah. So just getting back to this question of bias and discrimination, and the way kind of algorithmic decisions can instantiate bias and discriminate against people. I'm really interested in this question of like how we decide what is fair in the context of a decision made by an algorithm or with the help of an algorithm. So I think you say at one point there are kind of, 21 different mathematical definitions of fairness. Without going into all of those in detail, I guess, broadly, you could say a decision is fair. Well, you might think a decision is fair if it doesn't take into account kind of sensitive characteristics, right, in the way the decision is made. Or you might insist that not only that, but also it's not using kind of other factors which might act as a proxy for those characteristics. Or you might think, well, it's only fair if, as a matter of fact, the outcomes are completely equitable between different groups. But those might come apart, right? So there might be kind of decisions which kind of satisfy one definition of fairness, but not another, right? So, I mean, how difficult is it to decide what we actually should be trying to achieve in terms of fairness with these systems? Because it strikes me that that's kind of not an obvious question, right?
Well, the idea of fairness is one that people have been trying to grapple with recently inside technological systems. And lots of people talk about alignment problems and, first principles, but I think the easiest way to start is to start with what's legal and what's not legal. And we already have rules for how society works. We might as well use them, because one of the problems in in Silicon Valley and technological systems overall has been people designing systems without regard for existing laws and policy and rules, right? So one of the stories I like to tell is actually start the book with this story, is a story about fairness and cookies. So when I was little, and there would be one cookie left in the cookie jar, my little brother and I would fight over who got the last cookie. And, a pretty common way to solve this problem, like if it were a word problem, right, in a kid's textbook would be, all right, well, you divide the cookie in half and each child gets 50% of the cookie. And that is absolutely fair. And a computer, if you gave a computer this word problem, would say, yes, each child gets 50%. And that is a mathematically fair way of solving the cookie issue. But in the real world, when my brother and I were fighting over the last cookie, we'd break the cookie and there would be a big half and a small half. Yeah. And then we would fight over who got which half. And everybody has been through this particular type of situation because everybody's been a kid. And so what I would say is, I would say something like, okay, if you let me have the big half of the cookie now, I will let you pick the TV show that we watch after dinner. And my brother would think for a second, he would think that sounds fair. And it was a socially fair decision.
Sure.
Right? So mathematical fairness and social fairness are not always the same thing.
Yes.
Right? And both are valid. Both are useful ways of operating in the world. But computers can only calculate mathematical fairness.
Yeah. So what is that distinction there then? Because that's really interesting. But it feels like what's happening in that example is there's a question about fair division of the cookie, sure, but then it becomes more complicated when you're comparing how much of a cookie you get against some seemingly completely different benefit, like who gets to choose what's on TV. So is that what computers can't do? They can't kind of weigh up, what might look like, to use a bit of philosophical jargon, incommensurable goods, right? So like watching TV versus having a bit of a cookie, it just like there's no obvious way of kind of drawing a balance between those two things. So is that what you're kind of pointing to there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's also power differentials at work.
Yeah.
Right? Like the older kid has an advantage in that situation because the younger kid is not going to be as good at negotiating, right? Yeah. There's, inherent difficulties that a human being can perceive and can understand that these things matter.
Yes. Yeah.
But a computer can't do that.
Yeah, good. And there's also a point about kind of equity versus equality, I suppose, that might be relevant there, that you take into account sort of not just who gets how much of the benefit in question, but kind of what the sort of antecedent conditions are. So each person might have, different needs that need to be taken into account. All of these things just extremely complicated. Humans maybe not necessarily perfect at making those kind of decisions, but it just looks like computers don't know where to start.
Right. And when you're a human being making a computer system that negotiates these kinds of decisions, if you're not taking into account all of the factors that actually matter, if you're just reducing it to something that can be calculated in code, you're not doing anybody any favors.
And the result is not actually, as a matter of fact, fair, by any kind of reasonable definition of fairness. Yeah. Good. Yeah. So when I was reading that example, it did occur to me what you should have done is one child divides the cookie and the other one chooses which half to have. That's how you do that, right?
That is also a good strategy, and that is one we never used in my house.
So if any listeners are facing that problem at the moment, they might want to try that strategy.
Yep.
Good.
One cut, one chooses. The other one cuts, the other chooses. Right.
There you go. Yeah. So there's loads of stories in the book. So that's a kind of personal anecdote you told there, but there's there's stories that have arisen, I guess, from your reading or your work as a journalist or your reading of other journalists. And some of them are really kind of jaw-dropping, or at least I found them quite jaw-dropping. And perhaps the most astonishing was the story about Robert McDaniel. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell that story and tell us what you think that says about the way we use technology.
Sure. So Robert McDaniel was minding his own business in Chicago, and he got a knock on the door one day, and it was the police. And they were there with some social workers, and they said, "Well, we have a computer model that has identified you as being at risk of being involved in a shooting. We don't know if this means that you are going to be the shooter or you're going to be shot. We just know that our computer model identified this location as being at risk of being involved in a shooting." And Mr. McDaniel said, "No, thank you. I'm not interested in your computer models. Like, I am not interested in your interventions. Please go away." And the police just kept coming back because there was this, kind of institutional imperative around using their computer model. And they had decided that they were going to do this intervention system, and they were going to show up. So they keep showing up at his house, offering, job stuff or gun safety or whatever. And he kept saying, no, thank you. Eventually, people in the neighborhood noticed that there were all of these police cars like hanging out at his house pretty often. And he got a reputation as being a snitch. And then he was shot because he got this reputation for snitching to the police. But the reason he had that reputation is because of the police using this computer model that was wildly inaccurate. So, that was horrible. And then he recovered, and then it happened again. So he got shot twice because of this computer model and because of the misguided efforts around the computer model. So I use this as a way of talking about the ways that police are using technology, sometimes very inexpertly, and the problem of too much reliance on technology in the criminal justice system. One of the big problems with these kinds of predictive policing technologies is that they are trained on crime data, which is not actually crime data. It is arrest data, right? So it doesn't measure which crimes actually occurred. It measures which crimes the police responded to or arrested people in conjunction with. And we all know there's a big difference in policing of rich and poor neighborhoods, of white neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods. So what happens is you get this kind of dangerous feedback loop where you feed a system on data about where arrests have happened, and you ask the system, all right, where do you think more crimes are going to happen? The system is going to identify the areas that have already been over-policed.
Sure. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you're using a particular set of data to train the system, and it just ends up kind of, as you say, in a feedback loop that's making things worse and worse. But it strikes me that, that's a really key element to that story. But it's the complete over-reliance on the system in the first place, right? So it's the fact that they use this system to kind of flag up a potential issue, and then they just completely failed to listen when the guy was saying, please stop coming round. It was sort of supposed to be for his benefit, but actually they didn't listen to what he was saying, and the results were appalling.
Yeah, it was a good example of techno-chauvinism.
Exactly right. So it's on the one hand, thinking the system is going to be more effective than it is, but it's also thinking it's appropriate to use the system in the first place when actually they'd have been better just not using it at all.
Exactly.
And as I say, kind of not listening to human beings who are kind of questioning the use of the system. And then there's another story in the book of is it Isabel Castañeda, which I found kind of fascinating and infuriating at the same time. So could you tell us that story as well, please?
Sure. Isabel Castañeda was a senior in high school during the pandemic, and her school shut down like everybody else's schools. And she was enrolled in an international baccalaureate program. So international baccalaureate is an international secondary diploma. And if you score well enough on your IB tests, you can get up to, I think it's 2 years of college credit at certain schools in the US. So Isabel was really counting on doing well on her IB tests because this was, a major part of how she and her family are going to be able to afford for her to go to college. So Isabel is also a heritage Spanish speaker. Really amazing student, straight A's, wants to be a professional translator, is just doing really well in school. But because schools have shut down, the International Baccalaureate exams can't take place in person. So IB, which again, international organization, decides that they're going to assign predicted grades to students based on the output of an algorithm. So they're going to assign imaginary grades to real students that they think the students would have gotten on the tests that the students didn't take. And Isabel was predicted to fail her Spanish exam, which is absurd because, as I said, straight A student, heritage Spanish speaker, in super advanced translation classes. But what happened in this case, and so Isabel was not alone. There were so many kids who were predicted to get bad grades by this algorithm. The same thing happened in the UK with Ofqual.
Yes.
They tried to predict grades on is it A levels or O levels?
I think it was A levels. Yeah, and
A-levels.
they ended up having to abandon it, didn't they? Because there were so many.
Yes, because
cases.
the algorithm did such a bad job. And what happened is something that is predictable to anybody who knows education statistics. It predicted that the kids who go to poor schools would do badly, and the kids who go to rich schools would do well. Because guess what? That is actually how the education statistics play out. Like poverty is a major contributor to negative academic outcomes. And, rich kids do better in school than poor kids. So one of the things we could do to deal with the education crisis is we could eliminate poverty and improve school funding. It's not a big secret. So at any rate, the algorithm just hosed a lot of students and got in the way of their educational opportunity.
Yeah, and it seems like what the problem there is, well, various ways of describing the problem, but one would be too much emphasis on kind of the accuracy of the prediction that's being made. So, the people programming that system were probably just evaluating it in terms of like how well it worked with the existing data and how accurately it predicted someone's likelihood of achieving a particular grade, right? Whereas actually what they should have been paying attention to is moral questions, basically, and questions of fairness, which is that it is just unfair to judge someone by their membership of a particular group, and it doesn't kind of matter what the sort of supposed accuracy of the data is there. The question is like, what are the requirements of fairness in terms of how you treat individuals in that kind of question, right?
Yeah. And I'm also really happy to say that Isabel did manage to get her to get those scores thrown out and to get credit for her Spanish study. But that's not a good system that somebody has to go and convince college administrators that there has been a computer problem.
Right.
That's not particularly efficient. It's not fair, even.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Could I ask one more question before we finish? Is that okay? So, I mean, it's really just kind of what do you think the answer is, and to what extent you think it's a question of better regulation versus kind of what's the responsibility of individuals or the responsibility of kind of the businesses or other people who are using these systems to make a change?
Well, I think that the obvious solution is that everybody should buy my book. That's step one. But step two is we are not going to find an easy way out of this situation. It's taken us 30 years to get into this mess. So it's going to take some time to get out of it. And it's going to take a combination of policy and individual action. I'm really optimistic about the policy conversations that are happening. I'm optimistic about the new EU AI Act. It's not perfect, but it is a step in the right direction. And we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good or even the adequate. And I think that people are going to have to challenge their individual techno-chauvinism and make different decisions about when and how we use technology.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So thank you, Meredith Broussard. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
All right, Jim, thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.